All right, today we are going to go through I'm just going to hit the high points on chapter two. Really, whatever I go through on the notes is what you're responsible for knowing. I think there's a bunch of other stuff in chapter two that really overlaps with your chemistry classes, but I am going to hit the high points. So if it's on the notes, it's what you need to do, or it's what you need to know. We are on page 27 and we are going to go through page 30. So we don't have a ton to do today, but I want to talk to you about the chemical context of life. And these are the questions that you should be able to answer at the end of this lecture. What are the elements necessary for life? What are trace elements? What are the types of chemical bonds? And then we're really going to focus on the properties of water. And what are the properties of water, and can you explain why? Polar versus nonpolar, hydrophobic versus hydrophilic, and then just in general, acids and bases. And so the elements of life consist of 25 elements. 96% of the elements that make up life are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. The other 4% are various elements like phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, potassium, and then trace elements like iron and iodine. So when we go through the macromolecules, which I want you to remember is we are mostly going to see, and I don't think I like the order, CHONPs or CHONPS, CHOMPs. So the macromolecules are going to have these 6 elements, but it is important to know that there are other elements that are involved in life. So, like I said, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen make up about 96% of body mass, and that includes water. And then you have about 3.7 or 4% of these other elements, these essential elements right here. And then down here, what I want you to notice in this table is you have these things called trace elements. So what I need you to write down is trace elements. Well, you don't have to write that down because it says it. I want you to underline 0.01%. 0.01%. But then I also need you to write somewhere that trace elements are vital for life. They're only needed in small quantities, though. So the misconception is, oh, trace elements aren't important. No, they are. You just need them in small quantities. But if you don't have them, you won't be able to live. All right. And then I would like for you to underline fluorine, iodine, and iron, and have those memorized as trace elements. So they're called trace elements because they're in really, 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 really small quantities. However, they are vital for life. For example, the reason why they are in such small quantities. So they're vital for life, but they're in such small quantities. And here's an example: fluoride. Fluorine is one of the trace elements. Fluoride and saliva work together to protect the tooth enamel from plaque. However, if you have too much fluoride, you have what's something called dental fluorosis. So you can't have too much. Iron is another trace element. Iron is needed to help hemoglobin function and to carry oxygen to your organs. But if you have too much iron, you end up with, and I'm not going to read through this list, it's just called iron toxicity, and you get all of these things. You don't want them too much. So they're vital for life, but you can't have too much of them. Let's talk a little bit about chemical bonds. Our strongest bonds are going to be covalent bonds, which are the sharing of electrons. And then you have 2 types of covalent bonds, polar and nonpolar. Polar covalent bonds means that electrons are not shared equally. The more electronegative atom is going to pull electrons towards itself. And so what I want you to see here is that water is polar. Oxygen is more electronegative than either one of these hydrogens. Therefore, oxygen pulls hydrogen's electron towards itself, causing a partial, that's a delta symbol, a partial negative charge. Since hydrogen's electron is pulled towards oxygen, it then results in a partial positive charge on the hydrogen. So the reason why this is a polar molecule is that it has partial charges. And what we know about charges is they attract each other. So this partial negative on water is going to be attracted to a positive or a partial positive on another molecule. That is polar, and that is polarity. Nonpolar means that the electrons are shared equally between atoms. Here are two examples of nonpolar molecules. Your diatomics are all nonpolar molecules, oxygen, hydrogen. I'd like for you to also write CO2, which is carbon dioxide, CO2, which is carbon dioxide. And then I'd like for you to write hydrocarbons, hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are molecules made up of just carbons and hydrogens. Those are nonpolar as well. If you do not remember this from chemistry, then we need to talk, because I can't spend like a bunch of time on this, but polar and nonpolar are pretty basic chemistry concepts that you should have gotten in that class. All right, ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are a result of not sharing electrons, but a complete give and take of electrons. And so when we talk about ionic bonds, we are talking about a metal with a nonmetal, like NaCl. Sodium is a metal, chlorine is, or chloride or chlorine, whatever, is a nonmetal. And they bond together. Sodium completely donates its electron to chlorine, and therefore they result in complete charges. So sodium would have a plus, chlorine would have a negative. This is considered an ionic bond. And they're affected by the environment. So whenever a salt is put into water, it'll dissociate into its two ions. And so it's just important to know, ionic bonds between a metal and a nonmetal, it results in complete charges on ions. And so an ion would be an atom or a compound that holds, that should say that. Please correct that if I don't think, yep, it's a typo on your paper too, so please correct that. It would take me so much time to go back and re-record and reformat everything to make it perfect, so you're just going to have to bear with me on these things. So if you can change that to an A. An atom or a compound that holds an electrical charge is called an ion, and this is due to the imbalance between protons and electrons. So an ion is something that has gone completely given an electron or completely taken an electron. All right, some of our weaker bonds. Hydrogen's bonds are called weak bonds, but they are called strong attractions. So don't get confused on that. It is a weak bond, but a strong attraction. And so what a hydrogen bond is the partial positive on a hydrogen. The partial positive on a hydrogen strongly attracted to the partial negative on another polar molecule. That is a hydrogen bond, and those will be represented by dots. You should have gotten a lot about this in your chemistry class. So if you didn't, you're going to have to take some time outside of this lecture to really go back through some of that chemistry content, because it comes up over and over and over again in this class. So that is what a hydrogen bond is. It is the partial positive on the hydrogen. And why is the hydrogen have a partial positive? It's because the oxygen has pulled an electron away from it partially, causing it to take on a partial positive charge. All right, and then it is going to be attracted to a partial negative. So a hydrogen bond is between a hydrogen and something else that has a partial negative. Okay, van der Waals interactions are going to be slight fleeting attractions between atoms and molecules that are close together. This is the weakest. And van der Waals interactions, we won't talk a lot about these. I'll bring it up when we talk about protein folding a little bit, but they're so slight and fleeting, and they're so weak. And just our example would be a gecko being able to stick to a wall surface is because of the van der Waals interactions between the molecules on the surface of the gecko's little fingers there and the actual wall itself. What causes van der Waals forces are when you think of an atom, you think of, oh, the very center, the nucleus, has a positive charge. Well, those positives and negatives kind of get off balance sometimes. Sometimes you're going to have your negatives kind of over on one side and your positives kind of leaning towards another side, and then it'll quickly interact with another atom that has a positive leaning towards this side and a little bit of negative leaning towards that side. Now, I'm not your AP Chem teacher. I'm sure your AP Chem teacher probably had a better way of describing this, but if you just kind of see, okay, negative will kind of lean to the right, then it'll lean to the left. While it's leaning to the right, it'll kind of interact with another one that has positive kind of leaning. Just very slight, has to do with the imbalance and the location of charges at any given point in time. And just so you know, van der Waals are just very weak and fleeting interactions. All right, this is our kind of our summary of bonds. I need to make sure that you understand what bonds are. Typically, when students show up in AP Bio, this is information they already know. So if you don't know it and you don't understand it, you're going to need to speak up now, or you're going to have a lot of trouble later on. So just to summarize, a covalent bond is between two nonmetals, and it's a sharing of electrons. They can share equally to make a nonpolar molecule, or they can share unequally to make a polar molecule. And if the molecule is polar, there will be partial charges. An ionic bond is going to be a bond between a metal and a nonmetal that will involve a complete transfer of electrons from the metal to the nonmetal. And these are all important to life. Ionic compounds or ionic ions are going to be really important in nerve transmission. So we'll talk about ions a lot when we talk about how neurons work. Hydrogen bonds are going to be strong attractions between the partial positive charge on a hydrogen of a polar covalent molecule and the partial negative on the from an atom or from a molecule of another covalent polar. Hydrogen bonds are going to exist between two polar compounds or two polar molecules. All right, those are your charges, or I'm sorry, those are your bonds, your types of bonding. Let me know. I will kind of go over it maybe just briefly during the Zoom, but I do need to know if students have questions on that. All right, so all bonds are going to affect a molecule's shape and affect their function. And so the molecule that I am most interested in you knowing how bonds affect it are proteins. All right, so what I'd like for you to write down is proteins. The shape of a protein is very important to its function, and the shape of a protein is determined by the types of bonds that occur between the amino acids that make up that protein. All right, and so this is giving you an example of a protein receptor and a signaling molecule that fits into it. If that protein receptor was shaped any other way, that endorphin could not fit into it. Remember, endorphins are going to be your natural painkiller molecules. So when a person is like running and they get a runner's high, it's an endorphin that's actually bonding or docking onto a receptor and sending a cell signal like, hey, this feels good. Morphine is going to also fit those same receptors. So this is why when you have surgery, you can get morphine, and morphine will send the same signal like, hey, this isn't so bad, I don't hurt. And so I'm just trying to convey to you in this slide how important the shape of a molecule is. And the shape of a molecule affects its function. And the shape of a molecule is determined by bonding that occurs. And in this example, we're talking about proteins and the bonding between amino acids. And that's something you should have gotten in cell bio already. All right, let's talk about water. I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the properties of water and what make water so special. Let's go back to the bonding that occurs between the oxygen and the hydrogen. So water involves one oxygen and two hydrogens, and they are covalent bonds that occur between them, so they're sharing electrons. But because oxygen is so much more electronegative than hydrogen, it's going to pull hydrogen's electrons towards itself, and hydrogen's electron is going to spend more time in oxygen's little space than it is in hydrogen's little space. So what this results in is a polar covalent bond. So oxygen is going to have partial negative. If it's pulling hydrogen's electron towards itself, it's going to take on more negativity. So it's going to have partial negative, so that delta negative is a partial charge. Hydrogen is then going to take on a partial positive charge, Because hydrogen has that partial positive charge, it is going to be attracted to the partial negative on the oxygen of other water molecules. This is the basis of the properties of water, and what gives water its special properties is its ability to hydrogen bond with other water molecules and to hydrogen bond with other things, like cellulose, which is the carbohydrate that makes up the cell wall in plants. Cellulose is a carbohydrate. Cellulose is considered a polar molecule. Water will hydrogen bond with cellulose. and that helps water move up a plant. Water can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds with other water molecules or other things. So why 4? If there's 1, 2, 3 atoms in water, why 4? Each hydrogen forms a hydrogen bond, and then oxygen will form 2. So remember that number. All right, so now that we have the basis of hydrogen bonding between water, let's talk about the properties of water that contribute to life on Earth. Cohesion is the hydrogen bonding between water molecules. So this picture right here is showing you cohesion. So cohesion is hydrogen bonding between water molecules. Cohesion contributes to life on Earth. Your example is surface tension. So on the surface of a body of water, water molecules are hydrogen bonded to each other, which creates surface tension. And so this water bug, also known as a Jesus bug, is able to walk on water. It eats there, it lays eggs there, it does all of its living on top of water, and that's all contributed to cohesion, the hydrogen bonding between water molecules. All right. Adhesion is hydrogen bonding between unlike molecules. So like I said earlier, water can hydrogen bond with things like cellulose. So water can hydrogen bond with other polar molecules like cellulose. And so if water is hydrogen bonding to cellulose, which is what makes up the cell walls of plants, it's able to climb up because of those attractions, okay? So water can move against the pull of gravity because it can cling to the sides of the vessels of a plant because it is attracted to cellulose. Make sure to pause if you want to write some of this stuff down, but pretty much this is just chemistry review and a lot of just cell biology review too. Okay, transpiration is the movement of water up a plant. And so I've talked about cohesion and adhesion already. Cohesion is water clinging to other water. Adhesion is water clinging to other molecules like the sides of a plant. So water can actually move up a plant because water is clinging to other water and it's evaporating out of the pores of the leaves, the stomata. So water is clinging to other water, it's evaporating out of the pores of the stomata. Water is also clinging to the sides of the vessels because it's adhesion, it is attracted to cellulose. So that's called transpiration. All right, the third property of water is moderation of temperature. So heat is the total amount of kinetic energy in a system. Temperature is the measured intensity of heat due to the average kinetic energy of molecules. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is water has a high specific heat. It can absorb a lot of heat before it changes temperature. It can absorb a lot of heat before it actually evaporates. And so this is why if you have a really hot area, you can still maintain a stable, or the body of water can still maintain a stable temperature because water can absorb a lot of heat before it actually changes temperature. And so that's called high specific heat. All right. So pretty cool. And then humans are 65% or 70% water, and that's how we are able to resist temperature changes because of water's high specific heat. Water also has what's called a high heat of vaporization, meaning it can absorb a lot of heat before it goes from a liquid to a gas. And so evaporative cooling is when water absorbs a bunch of heat, then it evaporates. So if you're outside and you're really, really hot, the water in your body is going to absorb a lot of that heat. Then at some point it evaporates, taking the heat with it, and that is evaporative cooling. So it's not the actual sweat, liquid sweat on you that's cooling you. It's when the liquid sweat evaporates and takes heat with it that's cooling you. And so this also stabilizes the heat in a body of water because when water gets too hot, it will then evaporate, leaving cooler water behind. This can cool plants, and this also cools humans. So that's called evaporative cooling. And evaporative cooling is a direct result of water's high heat, high specific heat, high heat of vaporization. Okay. Water is also able to insulate. So we're on our last page here on page 30. And so water is able to Moderate temperatures by insolation. So the property of water I want to discuss here is that water becomes less dense as it freezes and it rises to the top, insulating the water underneath it, keeping it a little bit warmer. So because of ice floating and insulation of the water underneath, life is able to exist under frozen surfaces of ponds, lakes, and oceans. And ice can then also serve as a solid habitat for the animals and living things on top of it. All right. Water is also a really good solvent. And so it is the solvent of life. It is a solution is a liquid homogeneous mixture of two substances, and the solvent is the dissolving agent and the solute is the substance that's dissolved. Water is a really great solvent because of its polarity and its partial charges. It's able to basically almost like pull things apart. And this picture is showing you water and how water is surrounding that positive sodium and then surrounding that negative chloride ion. It is because of the attraction between the charges that it's able to actually dissolve things. And so like dissolves like, I want to just briefly discuss here hydrophilic and hydrophobic. If something is hydrophilic, that means that it is completely charged or it has partial charges and therefore has an affinity for water. It's attracted to the partial charges of water. And so examples of things that are hydrophilic are molecules that are polar or your ions. So molecules that have partial charges or full charges. And then examples would be cellulose, sugar, and salt, like NaCl. Blood is considered a hydrophilic liquid. Hydrophobic is something that repels water. Examples of hydrophobic molecules are molecules that are nonpolar, like O2, CO2, and then lipids and oils, also known as hydrocarbons. So you're going to want to write down that word hydrocarbon. Pause if you need to write down hydrocarbon right there, because that becomes very important when we talk about our biomolecules. The cell membrane, the tails of the phospholipids are considered hydrophobic. They're long hydrocarbons and they are nonpolar, and so they are hydrophobic. They repel water. All right, and so this is showing you a water-soluble protein and how the protein functions really well in water. And remember, in all living things and in the cell environment, it is aqueous, which means that there is water all over the place. And so hydrophilic molecules are going to function really well. Hydrophobic molecules have their place, and we'll talk about all of that stuff. Hydrophilic and hydrophobic a little bit later when we talk about biomolecules in the cell membrane. But you definitely need to know what makes something hydrophilic, what makes something hydrophobic, and the examples. The last thing that I want to touch on just really briefly is acids and bases. We are not going to go in depth here. All I want you to know is honestly, you don't even need to know this slide right here. Just cross it out. All I want you to know is this slide right here. Acids are going to increase hydrogen concentration in an aqueous solution. Bases are going to reduce hydrogen concentration. Make sure you have that memorized. Acids increase hydrogen concentration. They donate hydrogen ions. Bases reduce hydrogen ions. And then I need you to know the pH scale from 0 to 14. If a pH is less than 7, that means it's acidic. If it's greater than 7, that means it's basic. And if it's at 7, that means it's neutral. Most biological fluids are between 6 and 8. Your blood is going to be, I think it's 7.35. So I would write 7.35 next to this blood. And then I would just know some basic examples like battery acid, lemon juice, vinegar are all acids. And then oven cleaner, bleach, household ammonia are bases. And then pure water is neutral. And human blood and tears are going to be near neutral. And then the other thing I'd like for you to circle is gastric juices. So your stomach is going to have a pH around 2. So stomach acid is a pH around 2, and then blood is a pH around 7.35. All right, so I did go kind of quickly through that. You do have the ability to rewind. You have the ability to ask me questions during Zoom, but pretty much I do expect students to come to AP Biology with a good understanding of polar, nonpolar, hydrophilic, hydrophobic, the properties of water, and just the basic information about acids and bases in the pH scale. And I made it right under 25 minutes, and I will talk to you guys later.